Hi, everyone. This is AASTHA, and welcome to another episode of the Live Longer World podcast. I know I've been a little quiet lately, so it feels fantastic to be back. I got really interested in the alternative education space in the last year, which is part of the reason this podcast was on a bit of a break. And also, as a personal update, I got married earlier this year. It was a wonderful, wonderful time, and I just think it's a very beautiful bond. Anyhow, that's it for personal updates. And going forward, I hope to release more episodes this year and beyond. So please stay tuned. Without further ado, let's get into today's episode. My guest today is Dr. Geoffrey West, the author of the best-selling book Scale: The Universal Laws of Life, Growth, and Death in Organisms, Cities, and Companies. He is a physicist who got fascinated by the field of aging and longevity and asked the question of why we live as long as we do and no longer. So, in today's episode, we dive into his research on the scaling laws in biology and longevity. Hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did.
All right. Well, hi, Dr. West, and welcome to the Live Longer World podcast.
Thank you, AASTHA, for inviting me. I look forward to our conversation.
I'm very excited for our conversation as well. I read your book, The Scale,
Yeah.
and I think it's fascinating because you touch upon a lot of different topics, which is scaling laws across aging, longevity, death, cities, and companies as well. So it's quite a wide range of topics. Can you provide some context for the listeners on what your book is about and what are these scaling laws that you discuss?
Yes, so yes, it's hard to do that in a very short few sentences, but roughly speaking, the original idea of the book was to present a way of thinking about these highly complex systems that are continually evolving and adapting, contain huge numbers of components, have emergent laws, and so on. And, much of my feeling is much of the 21st century will be more and more oriented towards really trying to understand these systems. And, it's a daunting problem, but one of the things that is so extraordinary about them, and that's what is the central focus of the book, and that's why it's called Scale, is that despite their extraordinary complexity, and despite the fact that they are always evolving and adapting, and therefore they're kind of historically contingent, nevertheless, when you plot the various characteristics of them versus their size, you see something extraordinarily simple. So, and just one of the classic example, and one that got me sort of into all of this, is something called Kleiber's law of metabolism, which is that if you plot the metabolic rate of, let's say, mammals, just to keep it, so just mammals for the moment, versus their size, and you plot it on a log-log plot, which means you go up by factors of 10 rather than linearly, you see a straight line. And it's sort of amazing because here's maybe possibly the most complex phenomenon in the universe, namely metabolism, sustaining life. And not only that, each organism, each one of these mammals has its own history, and each component of it has its own history. Each cell, each genome, each organ, and so on has its own evolutionary history. And so from that, you would have thought when you plotted the points, well, there might be some correlations, obviously, because they're all mammals, but the points will be spread sort of all over the graph, sort of reflecting the historical contingency of their evolutionary path. And yet they all line up on this straight line. And I come out of physics. I'm a physicist by training and profession. And that was sort of a huge red light goes off, and you say, my God, so underlying this evolutionary history must be some really powerful constraints. And so that's what sort of got me into it. But what is even more extraordinary, just staying within biology, is that almost anything you could measure about organisms, and when I say organisms, I mean organisms, not just mammals, but birds, fish, even cells and crustacea and so on. But anything you can measure about them in terms of their physiology or indeed their life history, one of which is indeed longevity, has a similar characteristic. And you plot them on these logarithmic plots. They approximate, in some cases, extraordinarily well. In other cases, with quite a bit of variation, but they approximate very well these simple straight lines. And just for those that are familiar, that means mathematically that they're what we call power laws. And we can talk about that maybe in a little bit. But anyway, so the book is, first of all, talking about those, using those as a central theme, because those scaling laws are not just across mammals. As I said, they're across all of life, all manifestations of life, including cities and companies, and even universities, if you like, and social organizations. So there's something kind of fundamental going on, and the book orients itself towards the work that I was very much involved in, and that is that underlying all of these scaling laws, and we can elaborate on this maybe, are networks, is the mathematics and physics of the networks that distribute energy and information. And so that's sort of the core of the book. But I set up the book by asking just a bunch of questions about life in general, like, why is it that we live 100 years, since this is the topic that you're interested in. But, those kinds of questions, and, why is it that we grow and then stop growing? Whereas, cities, for example, seem to be open-ended growth, and so on and so forth. So a whole bunch of these sort of big, general, what I call coarse-grained questions, just of the world around us, and most importantly, unifying them in a single framework. So that's a sort of long answer to.
No, that's actually perfect. I love how you have those questions in the front of the book, because it grasps the reader's attention. That's right. Like, why haven't I asked these questions before? And I love how you set it up as well by saying that, well, we have these complex adaptive systems, which is just biology and the human body, but also cities, also companies. But what's going on underneath these complex systems? And you're saying that there are these simple scaling laws, which can be quantified,
Yes.
and give some meaning to the complexity that seems to be happening on the surface.
Yes. So yes, and just to pick up on that, and I didn't emphasize this, as I said, I'm a physicist, and so to me, a scientific explanation is more than just being qualitative, which of course these systems being so complex often is the case, that's all you can do is make a kind of narrative or qualitative explanation. But coming out of physics, that's not sufficiently satisfying. I need to have a quantitative, analytic, computable, mathematizable theory that can really predict things. And of course, it may well be, and that's still an open question, that you can't do that for these systems. And part of the effort here is to show that you can go some way to realizing that. And a big open question is, how far can you go? How far can you take that kind of, I'll call it physicsy kind of paradigm, into these other sciences, which are so much more complex and potentially so much more complicated than physics. I mean, physics could be defined as in those terms as the science of the simple, whereas biology, social sciences are the sciences of the complex.
No, I love it when people use the knowledge in one domain and just apply it to something else. You always come up with new creative ideas. So you mentioned networks as something that's underlying some of these scaling laws. Can you dive a little deeper into what you mean by networks here?
Yes. So of course, for us, just as a mammal, our human body, networks are things like our circulatory system, our respiratory system, our renal system, our brains, and I mean, what they are, of course, just I mean, for us, it's taking something that's macroscopic, like the food we eat, or the air we breathe, and delivering it down to cells. And to do that, you have to have this kind of branching network going through, being pumped by a pump, in our case, beating heart, and using blood as the vehicle within the network to transport energy, resources, and in terms of our brain, information to the cellular and intracellular levels. So it's a network of that kind. In the same way, within a city, in order for people to be connected with one another, we have road networks and transport networks in general, and then we have informational networks like telephone systems and the internet and so forth. And these are all highly connected structures, and which services and sustains the individual components. In our case, cells. In a city, the people, and so on.
And how is that connected to scaling laws?
Yeah. So that's the complicated thing, and that's the challenge. So just going back to what I said, when I first learned about these scaling laws, first that, within a taxonomic group like mammals, that almost everything scales in a similar way. What I didn't say is that the slope of that line for metabolic rate approximates very closely the number 3/4, curious number, and 0.75 roughly, and it's been known since about the 1930s. But it turns out that all these other scaling laws for things like, heart rate, growth rate, the number of offspring, how long you live, and so on and so forth, all of them have slopes that are simple multiples of 1/4. So number 4 plays a very central role. So that's the first thing. There's kind of a universality among the different characteristics, whether physiological or life history. But it's also true the same quarter occurs not just in mammals, but as I said, in birds and fish and plants. And so plants, I mean, my God, plants have a completely different structure to us, yet this number 4 occurs. And you ask yourself, that's pretty weird. How can it be that completely different evolved engineered designs, I mean, we're very different than the plants, like the trees I see outside my window here. How can that be? And then you realize, well, one of the things that every organism has to face is, how do you feed all the cells? All this, we have 10 trillion cells in our body. How in the hell do they get fed in a sort of, roughly speaking, efficient and democratic fashion? And how is that true also of a tree and so on? And then it sort of becomes obvious that it's the thing that makes it is common among all of life, including cities and companies and universities and so forth, is for all these networks have developed so that you can distribute energy and information to the local components. So networks, clearly, it sort of became clear. It wasn't so obvious at the beginning, but once one thinks about it a bit, it's somehow something to do with as I say, the constraints, the mathematics, the physics of these networks. And by the way, these networks tend to be, the majority of them are hierarchical, like the one I talked about, circulatory system. We have a heart, we have an aorta that comes out of the heart, which is maybe an inch or so in diameter. And then it gradually branches down to smaller and smaller vessels to the size of capillaries, which then feed cells. And so it's also kind of hierarchical in that sense. And so the work that I originally did was simply to try to model that by doing the mathematics of such a network. And to cut a very long story short, out of that popped all these scaling laws. The 1/4, we understood where the 1/4, the 4 came from, why 4 was the number that, in a certain sense, constrains all of life around us. I mean, all of biological life, may I say, around us. And it comes out of the generic principles of the network. And that's another thing. Since the engineered design of these networks are so different, whatever the properties of the networks are that give rise to these scaling laws, they must transcend the specificity of the design of the networks, because, as I said, a tree and a human being are quite different in terms of their networks. Even though, if you tore open my chest and looked at my circulatory system, of course it is tree-like, or my lungs are tree-like, but they're quite different, because a tree, even though it looks like our insides, is a bunch of fibers joined together. It's like an electrical cable that sprouts out, whereas we're like the plumbing in your house. It's just a bunch of tubes. So that's putting it in very simple terms. But anyway, if you put that into mathematics, you can solve these problems. But the constraints, or the assumptions, or the principles of these networks have to transcend that design. So let me just say what those are very briefly. There are sort of three major ones. One is they have to be what seems sort of obvious and trivial, what we call space filling. That is, your circulatory system has to go everywhere in your body. Every cell has to be fed. Otherwise it dies, and that's not it. Or, and just by way of jumping to something completely different, in the same way that the roads in a city have to go everywhere. They have to feed I'll call it every house, or every building has to be, a road has to end, something has to end there, otherwise they're not part of the city. And so that's called space filling, and it sounds obvious, but you have to put that into mathematics. You have to put that into a mathematical statement. The second is sort of derivative of natural selection. That is that the terminal units of the network, that is, just taking the circulatory system, the capillary, the last piece that feeds the cells, is what we call invariant. It doesn't change whether you're a human being, a mouse, or a whale, because those terminal units are like the building blocks of the network. And natural selection did not, every time it created or evolved a new species, did not reinvent the basic building blocks. It built on those building blocks, and what it did is it adjusted the network to the appropriate size in order to fill whatever the environmental niche that it was filling, so to speak. So there's kind of this invariance of our capillary. So our capillary, even though a whale is so much bigger and a mouse so much smaller than us, basically our capillaries are the same. I mean, we're basically identical, actually. And so it is with other parts of our, other networks in terms of their terminal units. And just as another example, why trees, if you look at the leaves of trees, they don't vary very much. I mean, a tree can go from a small shrub, basically, to a giant, well, sequoias don't have leaves, but to a giant oak. And the size of the leaves hardly varies, actually. I mean, you can change by several orders of magnitude, but, a leaf could be, I don't know, a couple of centimeters in length. But even though a tree may be, a million times bigger, the leaf isn't a million times bigger. It's basically the same size. It's the same kind of idea. So that's the idea. Even though leaves, of course, vary, but they don't vary by orders of magnitude relative to the change of size of the organ, and that's typical. And the last assumption or principle is really the most powerful and most extreme, and that is, so let's take the circulatory system. The circulatory system that we all share as mammals, for example, has evolved so as to be optimal in some sense, in the sense that the amount of work the amount of energy you have to allocate to pumping blood through your circulatory system, the amount of work that your heart has to do to keep you alive, pumping through, is optimal in a general sense, optimal for all mammals, in the sense that if you were to change the network, if you were to say double the size of the third branch of your arterial system, you would have to do more, your heart would have to work harder. But if you halve the length, it would have to work harder. Or if you increased it by 20%, or if you increased the fifth branch by 35%, any change like that, you have to work harder. And the idea is that and it's quite idealized, and the idea is the implied continuous feedback and sort of honing of the system over evolutionary times has optimized the system in that very coarse-grained way, so that you can minimize the amount of work that you have to do to keep alive in order to maximize the amount of energy you can allocate to sex and reproduction, to pass on your genes. So that connects it to classic Darwinian fitness of maximizing reproduction, reproductive ability. So anyway, that is a very powerful assumption, because if you mathematize things, I mean, in fact, just a side comment, most people don't realize that almost all the fundamental laws of nature arise from optimization principles. Something I'm not going to go into that, it's highly technical, and so it's taking over that kind of paradigm of philosophical view to biological life, that in fact evolution has led towards a trend, let's put it that way, towards these networks being in some sense optimized. And in this sense of for the circulatory system, optimizing the amount of minimizing the amount of energy you need to do. But it could be, in other systems, it might be the time to deliver something is minimized, or in your brain, it might be, in terms of the time to send signals through your neurons might be minimized. But anyway, the idea is something has been optimized to improve your fitness and gain advantage over other organisms.
So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but is there something to do with, as we age, maybe the optimization starts to break down, which is why we work harder, or maybe the repair of the damage is slower, and hence we start aging faster?
Yes, indeed. And it is connected to that. And in fact, so I don't know if you want to switch to talking about aging and mortality, but you can, is what your main interest here is. But so, here's a theory that was developed. This theory to, first of all, understand these scaling laws, but you get so much more for it because you understand the network structure, and you understand from this sort of macroscopic view what's keeping you alive. And by the way, you can also do it for all networks down to intracellular networks. But and you have a mathematical theory, and you can apply it to many things. And the kinds of things, first of all, we applied it to were growth, understanding growth, and we can maybe talk about that separately. But growth, things like sleep, which I will come back to because it is connected with aging, actually. But many, many different things we could apply to, because we understood not just the scaling between organisms, but the scaling within an individual organism. That is how your network scales within you. And not only that, the flows of resources within those networks, what's flowing in those networks. So that was the idea. And one of the things, just to repeat what I said, at the beginning, its main success was that it explained the origin not just of these scaling laws, but of this quarter power, the 3/4 metabolic rate. Now, one of the consequences of that 3/4 power scaling and metabolic rate, that's called sublinear, because what it says in English, very roughly speaking, is if I double the size of an organism and I double the number of its cells, you would have naively expected you would have to double its metabolic rate. You need twice as much food because you have twice as many customers out there. But no, that's not what happens. You actually only need 75%, roughly speaking. That's what the scaling law says. It doesn't matter where you scale from. You can scale from 2 grams to 4 grams or 200 kilograms to 400 kilograms. Doesn't matter. You save 75%. So, put it slightly differently, you are much more efficient than your dog or cat because you're bigger and you require less energy per cell or per gram of tissue to stay alive. Your cells need much less energy in a systematic, predictable way. So if you plotted on a similar plot the metabolic rate of your cells in vivo, that is in your body, versus the size, it would be decreasing in a systematic way. And by the way, the slope of that line would be 1/4. Anyway, it decreases in a systematic way. And that already gives you a hint about aging, because the idea, at least developed from this theory, is that, yes, this network is keeping you alive. It's sending resources to the cells, but it's a network. It's like the roads and the roads in the city or the pipes in your house. Eventually they wear out because things are flowing through them. There's friction, there's viscosity, and there's always dissipation. And in general, it's the second law of thermodynamics, which is the most fundamental law in science, transcends everything, which simply says that if I create order in a system, if I have an organism or an iPhone or a city, and I obviously supply energy to it, in transforming that energy into useful energy, I create useless energy. I create disorder. And that's called entropy. That's inevitable. That's just fundamental. Therefore, in eating and metabolizing, you are necessarily creating entropy, because what you're actually doing is wearing yourself out. Now, of course, you also have repair mechanisms, but it becomes increasingly harder and harder to continue repair. It's a huge amount of energy to repair the damage. So just to be very specific about it, although it's a simplistic way of saying it, that blood flowing through your circulatory system, as an example, what is it doing? It's the molecules or the cells are crashing against the cells of the sides of the walls of the vessels, and they do damage, just like the roads do damage when cars go over them eventually. And even though you try to repair them, as I say, it costs a lot of money, but that damage is done inextricably, inevitably, and continuously. And we have a theory, and we can calculate that. And we can calculate how long it takes. And we can also see that the amount of damage being done is smaller per unit of tissue, per gram of tissue, the bigger you are, because the metabolic rate of a cell is decreasing with size in a systematic way. Therefore, there's less damage done per gram of tissue the bigger you are. Therefore, the bigger you are, systematically, you live longer. And you can put all that into mathematics, and you can derive the scaling law for longevity, how long you're going to live. And idealistically, if what I said was exactly true, longevity would scale with an exponent, a slope. That is, if I plotted lifespan against size logarithmically, it would have a slope of plus 1/4. It would increase with 1/4. And the data supports that, but it has a huge amount of variance in the data. And I can talk about that, why that's the case. Some of that is to do with the fact that there isn't, despite the data, there isn't a systematic study. It's very hard to study longevity, actually, across many different animals. And what we're talking about here, and this I probably need to emphasize, really is maximum lifespan, because you die, obviously, for lots of, you can die at 1 day old, and you can die at 10 years old, and you can die at 100 years old for very different reasons, because there's all kinds of, obviously, there's all kinds of infections, there's all kinds of other things and so forth, heart attacks and so on and so forth. So this is what could you conceivably live to if you didn't get a disease, for example. So I'll put it slightly differently. Let's take it out of the domain of biology and talk about automobiles or engines in general. So you buy a car, and if you just follow, so the question being asked here is, if I buy a new car and I follow what it says you should do in the handbook. First of all, you have to feed it. So you always go to the gas station and fill it with gasoline. That's its metabolism. And it tells you, every 6 months or whatever it is, every year, you have to take it in and get service and so on. And you just follow that. Question: how long can that car conceivably last if you just follow the rules? Is it 6 months, 6 years, 60 years, 6,000 years? Well, we know the answer to that roughly. Actually, we know it better in miles. We know that cars used to be, when I was growing up, probably, if you were lucky, it might make 100,000 miles. Now, more like 150,000 miles. And of course, there's outliers to that. Might be that you could get one that goes 200,000 miles, but no car will last 1 million miles unless you do some extraordinary intervention. That is that you hardly ever drive it. You repair every week you're tinkering with it and changing the oil and replacing this and doing that. That's why you have antique cars. Okay, so that's very special. So we're sort of similar to that. There's a rule book. When we were sort of hunter-gatherers, we knew there was a rule book. You have to eat these berries and you have to go hunt these animals, and you do that. That's your metabolism. And, and you learned that to do things, maybe, I don't know how much hygiene there was, not very much probably, but some. And you had to wipe your bottom and, I don't know about washing your hands even, but you certainly had to be careful of excrement and so on, and you were careful about that. But that's about it. There were certain things that had evolved, and most people would die. We know, I don't know about hunter-gatherers, but we do know, and I talk about this in my book, that in 1830, the expected lifespan of a human being on the planet was probably about less than 35 years. Gradually, by changing the rules, that is, both in terms of metabolism, eating maybe broader, more diverse diets, and what was probably the most important thing, the most important intervention was hygiene. Was having running water and the sewers and so on. And that's why, lifespan took a major leap, so that in the year my father was born, 1914, his expected lifespan was 60 in England. I mean, he was born in England, and he died at 61. Perfect. Terrible for me, but perfect. But he hit right on. He lived as long as he should have lived, according to that original statistic. By the time I was born, that number was more like, it increased by maybe 10 years, and I've exceeded that. And that's because of other improvements, other interventions that you're obviously we're all very familiar with, mostly now. But the biggest one was hygiene and running water. But now, obviously huge improvements in medicine, antibiotics and surgery and so on, so that, many of my friends and colleagues would not be alive, obviously, if not for that. But the question remains, with intervention, continuous improvements and intervention, how long can you live? Is there still an upper limit? And as you know, and you wouldn't be doing this podcast, there are lots of people, in fact, as far as I can tell, the majority of people who seem to think in one way or another it's sort of open-ended. I'm going to stick my neck out and say that I don't understand how they come to that conclusion, because they don't have a theory of why you're aging and dying in the first place, and they don't have, most importantly, a quantitative theory. So my quest was, where does 100 years come from in the first place? Why is it 100 years in the first place that is sort of the order of magnitude of a human lifespan, and not, I don't know, 10 years like a dog, or 1,000,000 years? Why can't, what is determining that? Where does that tend, not just what determines aging and mortality, but what determines the scale of it, the 100 years? And I take an extreme view that unless we have a handle on that, talking about, well, we can do this, I could do telomeres, and I can do gene manipulation, and you're going to live to 250 years, and Elon Musk will still be trying to deal with Twitter in the year 2500. This is kind of the cartoon image. I find very unscientific from a physicist viewpoint. So I push back on that. It's not that might not happen. It's simply that I don't find the basis there, and of course it's sort of interesting, because this field, when I first started thinking about this problem, which got me into all this scaling work, which is, by the way, which is kind of curious, the thing that got me into thinking about scaling was my own mortality, actually, because my father died at 61 and I was in my 50s, and I thought, gee whiz, I may have at best, I probably only have 5 or 6 years, but I may have 10 years to live. Why? And then I started wondering, why is that? Why is it that, and that got me into it. And what got me into the whole scaling thing was that I began to realize that if you want to understand aging mortality, you first have to understand what keeps you alive, because something's gone wrong with what's keeping you alive. So you better understand metabolism first, and then figure out what's going wrong with metabolism. And that's why it got me into finding out about scaling of metabolic rate and the scaling of lifespan, and building this theory, which has built into it, that theory of metabolism and the sustainability of life has built into it its own death, inevitable, or its own demise. Whether it's death is maybe a separate question, but it's certainly a certain aging phenomenon. So that's what sort of got me into this, and why I'm pushed back on glib statements about open-ended increase in mortality. And I'll stop there, and I'll elaborate on that as you ask further questions.
I think that's a very fair pushback. And it sounds like what you're saying is that even if we, say, intervene every week with, say, things like caloric restriction or fasting, which we sort of have some data that it can improve longevity, we first need to quantify how much those interventions can actually increase our maximum lifespan, in order to know whether we can live for indefinite period, or if there's still a cap to our lifespan.
Right. So, by the way, I didn't say, so I'm glad you brought up caloric restriction, because one of the things about this theory, it wasn't just, so I've done the calculations, you can derive the scaling law. It's very hard to describe. You can understand where 100 years comes from, but one of the good pieces of news in terms of extending lifespan is that it's very hard to be specific about that. There's great variance in that number, okay, in that number 100, if it's 100. But the scaling also means that the same theory that would predict a human being should live for about 100 years maximally predicts that a mouse can't live for more than 2 or 3 years. A mouse cannot live for 50 years or 100 years. And in fact, no mouse has ever lived for more than a few years. So this theory, being a physicist, it has many predictions, one of which is caloric restriction, because it says metabolic rate, since this flow is basically a proxy for metabolic rate, the flow through the network is a proxy for metabolic rate, and it's that which is doing damage. So decrease your metabolic rate and you'll do less damage and you'll live longer. And you can actually do the calculation and predict how much, and it agrees with the data, some of the data. It's been controversial. I haven't followed it in detail in recent years, but it agrees with much of the earlier data. There was this controversial data, I think, from the University of Wisconsin on monkeys, which did not show caloric restriction and so forth. And I've not looked at that in detail, but the theory does predict caloric restriction. So, and one would need to understand why those experiments, and if there have been others that don't agree with it, don't agree either. And this predicts quantitatively how much you can increase your longevity. I mean, the theory predicts not just that you would have caloric restriction would increase your longevity, but by how much. But there's another piece which is very powerful, that there's another way of changing your metabolic rate. It's not just by the amount that you eat, and that is by changing your body temperature. Because the way I've talked about metabolic rate was in terms of the kind of macroscopic view of the flow through networks. But of course, metabolism is a biochemical reaction, production of ATP in your cells. That's your currency of energy. And that's a chemical reaction. And the laws of chemical kinetics tell you that reaction rate depends upon temperature. And it depends, and it's much more sensitive to temperature than it is, in fact, to how much you eat, because it's exponential. It comes out of statistical physics, and that law is an exponential. So that says a small change in temperature can produce an exponentiated change in your metabolic rate, and therefore an exponential change in how long you're going to live. And that's been derived that. And indeed, it agrees extremely well with data. Because one of the things most human beings don't realize is how unique we are in having a fixed body temperature, because the rest of the biosphere is exponentially sensitive to temperature. And just a total side tangential comment to that, that's why global climate change is so critical. 1 to 2 degrees, which seems like something trivial, is a huge effect on the biosphere, not on you or me. You or me, we evolved this extraordinary thermostat that keeps us at 98.6 or what was 37.5 in centigrade. It keeps our body pretty much fixed temperature. But we've looked at all the data on lifespan of what are called ectotherms, things that are not warm-blooded, and it fits beautifully, this exponential increase in lifespan when you change the temperature. So that's very powerful. But actually, there have been experiments done on mice by artificially lowering their temperature with drugs, and that agrees effectively with that. And so that's been very satisfying. And so it could be, if you wanted to do it, you could artificially lower your temperature and you would increase your lifespan. I don't recommend it in the same way that I don't recommend many of these other interventions that you can imagine, because one of the things, so I'm going to come back to predictions in a minute, but one of the things these scaling laws tell you, these scaling laws cover, I suppose there must be 50 of them, and they cover everything, as I emphasize yet again, all of your physiology and all of your life history. And what it's telling you is what we know: everything is interconnected and dependent on everything else in you and in your relationship to the environment. So if you mess around with one thing, if you make some major change in something, if you intervene, you're liable to screw other things up. And the best example we know of that is in our social being, that we've increased our active metabolic rate. If in our basal metabolic rate is about 100 watts. That's all. 2,000 food calories a day is, roughly speaking, 100 watts. You're a light bulb. You're an old incandescent. That's all you need. You're extremely efficient. We are extremely efficient. That's our metabolic rate. But our active metabolic rate, that's our basal. That means just sort of sitting here or sleeping or whatever. But your active metabolic rate, so if you're a hunter-gatherer back 10, 20,000 years ago, you would use between 200 and 300 watts. You'd running around and playing games, whatever you do. But if you ask what our metabolic rate is, you and I, living in the United States, that's 10,000 watts. That means our real active metabolic rate, because you need a car and a refrigerator and a house, and you need heating, and you need iPhones and so on. If you add all that up, because that's what your active metabolic rate is, your portion of that, it's about 100 times bigger. And so we've really intervened extraordinarily in our active metabolic rate, and we paid a heavy price because of all the problems we created on the planet. I mean, that's the price we paid. And the question is that sustainable? So that's sort of the biggest picture version of it. But you could think of it in terms of your own ecology as an individual, trying to intervene on that. And that's a very big question. No one knows the answer. And so we have to take great care in what kind of interventions we do. Most of them we've talked about have been positive: eating better food, getting better health care, better sewage, better water, and so on. Because that fits in with what the maximum lifespan, it hasn't affected. And one of the things you can look at is survivability curves over time. And even though, in 1835, the expected lifespan of someone living in Europe might have been 35 to 40 years, and my great-great-grandfather, it might have been 45 years, and my father 60 years, that's been increasing. The maximum lifespan, as far as we can tell, has never changed. There were people potentially living 10,000 years ago that could have lived, and probably did live, to over 100, 120, very few people. And hunter-gatherers, certainly there were people that lived into old age. But the sort of expected lifespan was much lower and has been continuously increasing because of these interventions. The maximum lifespan has stayed about 120. And there's this famous case of this lady in France that lived to 123, which is pretty amazing. But that's about it. I mean, very few people have lived beyond 120. And even though the number of centenarians, those living over 100 or even 110, continues to increase, but no one yet has gone much beyond about 120-ish. And that's again, it's in a certain sense a prediction of the theory I just described. There is a maximum, and that's it. It's about 120. So And the other thing is, this theory also predicts, by the way, it goes to the question that you asked, and that is the rate of aging. That is the number of damages that are occurring as a function of time. And in the theory, it actually comes out to be quite simple, at least in the first part of life. It increases linearly. The number of damages increases linearly with time. And towards the end of life, there's a feedback mechanism in those damages that it degrades the immune system, and it starts to exponentiate. So you start to age even faster at the very end. But you decrease, the number of damages increases linearly, which means aging should increase linearly. And indeed, if you look at all the proxies for aging, that is how well your various functions operate, are operating as a function of time, your various physiological functions operate, they do decrease linearly. And in fact, I'm at the age, if you look at the graphs, I'm under now 40% of what, say, my children are, or my people in their 20s and 30s. And the other thing that you realize that's fantastic is after you've stopped growing in your late teens, it's downhill from there on. You sort of plateau a little bit, and then I'm afraid it's downhill. And, well, of course, you could try to intervene with various things. Again, it's the same thing, good food. Exercise, people claim, keeps you a little bit better. I'm not sure there's any evidence that it might change the degree of aging, because it stimulates repair mechanisms, but it also creates more damage. And so the trade-off is not so clear as people claim, in my opinion, but it's clearly a good thing to do. It's certainly quality of life. And of course, in the end, that's it. Who cares about how long you live? It's quality of life. And that again goes to, if you do interventions. And so this theory tells you what you have to do. You have to intervene. Either you decrease your metabolism, which is what I talked about, or you increase what you allocate to repair, which is controlled by the genes. And you could do gene manipulation, presumably. Not the area of expertise I'm in, but you could imagine doing things, or changing telomere lengths, as people talk about, that actually increase allocation to repair, which you could imagine living longer that way. But brings up the question, all these things are interconnected. If you're allocating energy that was allocated to all these other things that are keeping you alive, or making you function and giving you a good quality of life, maybe by allocating to these other mechanisms, you decrease the quality of life, even though you live longer. And that's an open question. Of course, no one knows the answer, but it is a word of caution. Anyway, so I'm quite conservative in this, and in my views. And it's the conservatism and a certain arrogance that, having a theory provides you with better insights into the possible. And by the way, this theory is sort of interesting because it's not only in that sense is in contrast to the way most people talk about aging and mortality, but it's also in contrast in the sense that it is a big picture, coarse-grained one. It doesn't talk about specifics. And specifics, and I would argue that we need both. We need something like I've been trying to develop, and you certainly need all the detailed studies and specific investigations that people who work on aging and gerontology and so on are doing. That's where the rubber hits the road, and that's what we need to do. So even though I don't like some of the statements that come out about, we can probably live to 200 years or 150 or whatever, without any real substance to that. The work that they're doing is incredibly important. So I don't want to cast any aspersions on much of the work that's being done in these areas. I just want to cast some doubts about the wild hyperbolic conclusions or statements, speculations that are made.
I'm with you there. On the point of global climate change, you mentioned that it probably doesn't affect us that much, but it does affect other biofauna. But I would think it should affect us as well, right? If we're
Oh,
increasing our body temperature, we should, in theory, be reducing our lifespans.
oh yeah, no. Well, our body no, I mean our body temperature doesn't change. It does.
Yeah, I guess not the body temperature,
So I
right?
mean, it doesn't change us physiologically.
Hmm.
It powerfully changes us sociologically. I mean,
Right.
that's where it has its its enormous impact. And the big question is the kind of quality and standard of living that we have miraculously evolved in the last 10,000 years, especially the last 100 to 200 years, is that conceivably sustainable? I mean, we've really put ourselves way out of equilibrium or meta-equilibrium. And is it conceivably sustainable because of this huge change, especially in such an incredibly short period of time? I mean, even 10,000 years is nothing on the scale of which the whole system has evolved. And 100 years is absolutely a blip at best. So, and the change has been extraordinary. And so
And
that
there's
question
one.
is
Mhm.
that, can it continue?
No, you're absolutely right. There's one question, there's one thing you had mentioned at the beginning where you said that simplistically put, say the bigger the size of the organism, the longer you live, because of this metabolic efficiency. So does that mean if someone's, I mean, if as long as they're healthy body weight, if someone's taller, they should be living longer? So like people in countries that are on average height is high more.
No, there's a subtle difference between um, what's called interspecific scaling, which means across animals, and intraspecific within. And almost everything I'm talking about has been, the scaling has been primarily interspecific across. But you can apply it, and I have. In fact, I've been talking as if one could apply it intraspecifically, and indeed one can. But it's not intraspecific in the sense that you would necessarily live longer if you're bigger. And in fact, one of the problems here is that then what comes in intraspecifically, and which one needs much more work on, is there are so many other variables that start to enter into the problem that much more work needs to be done. But you need this as a point of departure or a framework for answering that question. But indeed, in sort of leading order, yes, bigger lives longer.
Interesting. Okay, but that's across a
Yes,
species,
yes, but
right?
naively, you would also conclude intraspecifically likewise.
I see. Okay, okay. But you're saying there's more work to be done there.
Yeah, there's certainly more
Because
work to be
right, because obviously, I mean, if you go beyond a certain level, which is like if you're obese, we know that's not healthy for you. So
done. Yeah.
bigger in that sense is not
No, that's right, exactly.
corresponding
So,
to maximum
you have
lifespan.
to be extremely careful is what you mean when you're talking at that level of granularity about size. So, so that's why I say there are these other variables that you need to take into account, and the kind of data that you need to collect to look at that. And and not enough of that has been done, surprisingly, actually.
Hmm.
And
I
by the
also
way,
want to talk.
oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
No, go on.
No, I was just going to say one of the things that just a kind of, I don't know, a philosophical view is that it's in constructing theories, even if they're simplistic, but they do capture some of the essential features of the problem. One of the spin-offs of that is it leads to asking questions and into investigations that you might otherwise not have thought about. And this area is one of them, this kind of question about extrapolating inter to intra, and questions therefore of things like obesity and so on and so forth, and genetic origins and so on. And so, I mean, at the rate of what I've been talking about, and in fact what scaling laws say, which is something I like very much, is that since they things scale in a very regular, systematic way, you're treating all human beings as basically the same. So even though you have a darker skin than I, and you come from a different continent and so on, as far as the scaling laws are concerned, you and I are the same. We have the same, and we are. I mean, that's what's incredible about the scaling laws and our genetic makeup. At some 90-something% level, well, maybe in the scaling laws, 90%, we are pretty much the same.
That's interesting.
Which is
I also liked your
and the deviations are actually quite small.
Mhm.
I mean, and just an editorial comment. That's why I find all of the ethnic and racial prejudice and statements is so bizarre. I mean, you're talking about these tiny differences that seem to play extraordinary secondary roles. So I find that, anyway, it is. I mean, we're not like, we haven't bred ourselves like dogs.
Mhm.
Think of the variation among dogs. I mean, it's extraordinary. They don't seem to care whether they're small or big, and they don't jump on each other. Anyway, we're going into, maybe we shouldn't go there with this.
So I'm also curious to discuss a little bit about just drug dosage and scaling laws in medicine and just drugs in general, because you bring up a very good point where a lot of R&D on drugs or just research or just cures for new diseases is tested on mice. Um, but the scaling laws are completely different for humans, and that brings up its own
Yeah.
host of challenges. And I think a few other scientists have discussed this as well. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yes, absolutely. Now maybe I should introduce it by the story that I talk about in the book about the
The LSD and the elephant.
LSD and the elephant.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll talk about that. It was something that was done long ago in the 1950s, when LSD was first discovered, so to speak. And one of the, and it wasn't known, it was known that it had very powerful neurological impact, but it was very unclear as to, what the mechanism was and what its results would be. But so there was a psychiatrist at UCLA, I think, actually, at that time. No, he was at the University of Oklahoma, I think. Hardly matters. But he was interested in a phenomenon that occurs in elephants, particularly Asiatic elephants, called musth, M-U-S-T-H, which you living in India, maybe you know about. But it is elephants apparently spontaneously can go sort of crazy. They sort of go through a bizarre period where they're highly destructive and they sort of rant and rage. And it was unclear as to what the origin of that is, and they're highly destructive. And certainly even back in the 50s, when elephants were used much more than they are today, I mean, they were part of the culture in Asia, and part of the workforce. So it was actually an important problem. The hypothesis was, not entirely crazy given the times, that maybe what was happening was that in these elephants, they were sort of auto-producing LSD in their brain, and they were going crazy for whatever reason. So the experiment was that you would take an elephant, inject them with LSD, and see if they go into must. So they got an elephant whose name was Tusco, and they injected him with LSD. But the question arises, how much LSD do you give an elephant? And it was known, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, the numbers, a lot of experiments, or some of the experiments were done on cats, and a few, of course, humans had taken LSD. But what they did is they took the dosage of a cat that they knew was safe and produced weird effects in cats, and they divided by the weight of the cat. So they got the dosage per unit gram, and then multiplied that by the weight of an elephant, just linearly. And they got, I forget what it was, 300 grams or so. I forget the numbers. It's crazy me trying to remember. And they got some humongous number for the amount of LSD to inject in poor old Tusco. And they injected poor old Tusco with this large dosage of LSD. And Tusco did indeed go completely nuts, and he went bonkers, and he died within an hour. And they concluded in this paper, published in Science, by the way, that elephants have an anomalous reaction to LSD. So, this brings up the question as what should they have done and so on. And I think over a moment's thought, you begin to realize that was, first of all, it was a bit irresponsible just to do that with such a huge dose without doing something a little more careful, maybe with other animals even. But anyway, so be it. But when you think about it, when you take a dosage of something, that, whatever it is, it diffuses across membranes. And that diffusion is governed by surface areas, since it's across areas. And areas, if you didn't know anything about what I told you before about scaling, there's traditional, what's called Galilean scaling, geometric scaling, which would say an area scales as the 2/3 power of metabolic rate. So instead of a few hundred milligrams, the dosage should have been a few milligrams. If you do the calculation, it decreases it enormously if you scale that way. Actually, the scaling probably is governed more by metabolism, because you metabolize that. So, and not only that, these surfaces are fractal-like. They have all kinds of crenellations and so on. So you could argue it's 2/3 or 3/4. It doesn't matter much, actually. It does, specifically in this case for the elephant, it reduces it enormously. But of course, that brings up the whole question of the scaling, exactly what you asked, the scaling of drug dosages. And the two obvious questions are, how do you scale up from experiments that are done on mice, which is where much of the work is done in pharmaceuticals, to humans? And concomitantly, how do you scale down from human beings to children and babies? And again, you would think that it would go either like this 2/3 power or 3/4 power if you were to scale up and down. And it's not that pharmaceutical companies aren't cognizant of this, but it's not clear how much they actually do it. What they should do, of course, is a combination of using what's known about the scaling laws, but they should also do some sort of, maybe they don't have to do as rigorous experiments, but they should do it. Okay, the rigorous experiments are done on mice for good reason. That's a whole subject of itself. But you could imagine doing very coarse-grained experiments where you do it on a mouse, then you do it on a cat, then a dog, and then, I don't know, what's the next one up? A sheep, I don't know. But you do it on animals and see, you actually do a crude investigation of what the empirical scaling law is for that specific drug. Because some drugs, of course, are systemic, first of all, and some drugs are local, and so on. And there's, a whole bunch of highly complicated biochemical reactions take place depending on the drug, and so on. So I've often wondered, and I have suggested that you don't have to do the same kind of rigorous kind of control experiments they do on mice to develop the drug, but you can do a very crude set of experiments going up, as I say, through animals of different sizes, and in particular, it seems obvious, from mice to rats to cats to dogs to, I don't know, foxes, but, and see, and then extrapolate that to human beings. So you have a much more data-based, science-based way of extrapolating, which would confirm what you would intuit from the scaling laws of metabolism and other physiological processes, the kinds of things we've been talking about. So, and I'm just surprised that hasn't been done, and in my opinion, it should be done. I'm not an expert in this, and there may well be good reasons why no one has actually done it. I have, by the way, just parenthetically, in my early work, been approached to work on some of these things by people in pharmaceutical departments, and even by the National Institute of Toxicology and Pharmacology. But I haven't. It's not an area that I was willing to devote a lot of my time to. And in some ways, I regret that I didn't actually take advantage of when those possibilities were available. But I'm just surprised there hasn't been more. So one of the things I talk about in my book is the extrapolation down to infants. And I remember my children were still quite young when I first did this work, and I had baby Tylenol bottles. And in those days, they had on the back of the Tylenol bottle, or on the packaging, in my language, the scaling of dosage versus size. So they would tell you both in terms of their age and their weight. It started, 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 15 pounds, and so on for the baby, and tell you how much you should use. And I thought, I remember first looking, I thought, that's great. They obviously know about all this stuff. And then I don't know why I didn't. It was sort of obvious if you actually look at it. But I actually took a piece of graph paper and I plotted the dosage versus weight, and it was exactly linear. And so, if you believe what I've been telling you, that meant that either a little baby is getting too big a dose, or a child of 8 or 9 years old is getting too small a dose, whatever. But something's wrong. It should be scaled. And in fact, almost certainly it should be scaling non-linearly. Whether, again, I would suggest 3/4, but 2/3 would do it enough. Anyway, now whether I'm not a medical person. I don't know. No one's ever paid much attention to this, as far as I can tell, even though I've written about it and so on. And whether it does damage. I mean, someone should actually look and see, has there been any actually adverse reactions from this?
That example definitely shocked me.
Yeah, it shocked me, frankly. And I've been still amazed that it didn't gain any traction and so on. Especially in, that was quite a while ago. And since then, we've become so much more sensitive to, quote, drugs in the more general sense of that word, and the problems caused by overdosaging. And by the way, potentially problems of a different nature caused by underdosing, which could be a possibility. I don't know.
That
But
also made me think of vaccines, just
yes.
in light of COVID as well. Does that mean that, in theory, people should have been getting, I know there was a different dosage for kids, but depending on your body weight, should you have been getting a different dosage?
Absolutely. Absolutely, no question. And
But it was standard for everyone,
I have
right?
seen some talk on it, but they sort of wing it, frankly, as far as I can tell. In the same way, I don't know if you know, uh, flu shots. If you're over
Hmm.
65 or whatever it is, and if you're old like me, you get the double the dose. Now they just made that up. I mean, no, seriously. I mean, why? Maybe it should be 1 point. It should change with age, of course. It should change with age. And maybe it should be, for my age, it should be double, but I'm 82. But maybe for someone 67, it should be 1.4. Now, whether that causes any problem or not, again, I'm no expertise in that, and so on. But it is weird, actually, frankly, that and part of what I wrote when I wrote my book was partly because of this, because the propensity is for linearity. Like that drug dose of Tusco the elephant, you just say it's linear, double the size, double the dose, or whatever. That's the kind of thing. And it permeates all of society. Double the size of the city, you might expect double the amount of crime. Ain't true. Just simply isn't true.
That's
And so
crazy. Yes, I think
and we use per capita indices all the time. It's
mhm.
the GDP per capita, and that immediately implies linearity. So and okay, for writing journalism in the news, but for actually determining policy, that is nuts. I mean, from a science viewpoint, we can do better. And for some things, for many things, it's probably unimportant, actually. But for some things, it could be extremely important. And we just need to think a little more non-linearly, which is what this is about. It's non-linear thinking versus linear thinking, and so that's sort of one of the big messages.
I love it. I think Nassim Taleb, who wrote a review for your book as well, I love his work. He also talks about how our
Sorry,
brains are not.
I missed your
Nassim
beginning.
Taleb.
Oh
Nassim
yes,
Taleb, who
Nassim.
wrote.
He's very. A thing I love about Nassim is that he's willing to say wild things, and just whereas I'm much more cautious and conservative, even in podcasts and interviews. But he's great. He speaks
Very
out.
straightforward.
He doesn't mind sort of getting pushback and being called other names and so on. I'm just too timid and sensitive, I think.
That's not true. I think your book uncovers a lot of important points that, I mean, just speaking of drug dosages, that I think we should talk about more.
Yeah, well, I did say that, but I was angry at that because I thought that's silly, that's incredible that we don't do more about that. So, by the way, I do want to say one other thing about the theory of sleep. It's to do with damage. I mean, the theory of aging. I'm sorry. Let me start that again. I want to talk about the theory of aging is that it relates to the theory of sleep because, and that's again part of the body of work of predictions that support the theory of aging, because the same theory of aging leads to understanding why we sleep and the question of why do we sleep 8 hours and why does a mouse have to sleep 15 or 16 hours and an elephant, which always shocks people, only has to sleep 3 or 4 hours, and a big blue whale only has to sleep a couple of hours. It's pretty amazing why that's, and it's the same mechanism because the idea is, first of all, you have to have a theory, a hypothesis, I should say, as to why do we sleep in the first place? And the idea is the same mechanism that leads to your aging, of course, would lead to the aging of your brain. I mean, you're wearing your brain out, obviously, by all that blood going in it to support the neural activity and so on. And And, if you're doing that throughout the rest of your body, and you're doing some repair, but you only have to do enough repair. And I didn't say this, and I should have done. You only have to do enough repair so that you live long enough, and this is where evolutionary biology comes in, to have, if you're a woman, to produce, in a natural state, 10 to 15 kids, of which maybe half or 60% survive. That's sort of how we, 100,000 years ago, when we were truly biological. And so that's why you only have to live till you're 35 or 40. And then that's it. And then natural selection doesn't care after that. And the theory of aging I describe is really a theory of how long could you conceivably live beyond that. Okay. So, but natural selection of its own only really cares about living long enough to be sufficiently productive, to maximize your Darwinian fitness. So, okay, so it doesn't care if your liver or your pancreas gradually wears out or your efficiency gets less. You can still go on pretty well into your 40s and so on, except for your brain. Because if you damage your brain, you're a different person. And that's not good. So what you have to do for your brain is different from everywhere else. You have to repair yourself faithfully. You have to make sure that your brain stays pretty much the same for those 35, 40 years, and maybe for 100 years. So you put a huge amount of energy into acting against the damage that has been done, repairing the damage that has been done by keeping your brain alive and your neural activity very in good shape. And it's very hard to repair a brain that is while you're awake. It's sort of like, you can repair your liver or pancreas maybe because you don't know about it, but it starts interfering. If you start, it's the same reason that you repair the subway system in New York at night, not during the middle of the day. You don't tear up Fifth Avenue or whatever the major subway lines are at 3:00 in the afternoon. You wait till there's almost no traffic or no traffic, and then you do the repair. So that's the analog to sleep. So we need a downtime to make these repairs. And at the same time, we need a downtime to use metabolic energy to process all that input that's taken place during the day. So both come from metabolic energy to both repair damage and to process input. So roughly speaking, the way this works is the damage and input that takes place during the day is sort of counteracted by repair and processing at night. So that on the one hand, you have, if you write an equation for that, on one side, you have the awake time, and on the other side of the equation, you have sleep time. So this tells you that the actual scaling, if you want to ask how does it scale, is actually not to do with sleep time and awake time, but it's the ratio of awake to sleep time. And that's what actually the data shows. But importantly, the damage that is being done is less, as I said, the bigger you are. That's why you live longer. So the damage being done per cell or per unit of tissue is less the bigger you are, so you live longer, but you do less damage to your brain, so you need to sleep less the bigger you are. So the bigger you are, that's why you sleep less than your cat, but you have to sleep more than your pet whale or elephant. And you can do the calculations, and it's very good. It turns out it's great. But it's the same theory. And that same theory that says you live longer, according to a predictive quantitative power law, tells you that you should sleep less. So it's again evidence in favor of that theory. And in fact, you can write a formula, believe it or not, that collects how long you sleep to how long you're going to live, because they come from the same damage repair mechanisms. So it's kind of cute, actually.
Can oversleeping be bad for you?
That I don't know. I don't know. This is again one of these, digging to a deeper level, and I'm not an expert in it, so I don't know. I don't know that it can be damaging, but what is certainly true from this is if you sleep less than your sort of canonical 8 hours a day, 7 hours a day, whatever that is, 7 or 8 hours a day, you will do, it's serious. And there were experiments done over 100 years ago where first experiments by a Russian lady who was effectively the first lady, I think, elected to the equivalent to the Academy of Sciences. But she did these experiments. They're not very nice. She took a bunch of puppies, little puppies, and fed them whatever they needed. So you feed it, they have as much food as they like, but would not let them sleep. Cannot sleep. Every time that would not allow them to sleep. And they die. They die. And people go crazy if they don't sleep, or they have you can even develop lesions in the brain and so forth. So lacking sleep. Of course, again, there's variation in this. I mean, the usual question there about maybe I should emphasize that earlier. I did sort of say it in passing. There's variation among all these things. There's some kind of distribution, obviously. I mean, some people, for whatever reason, may only need 6.5 hours sleep, and there may be people that need 9 hours of sleep, and so on. But it's clear that you can't live on 3 hours of sleep. I mean, certainly you and I don't know about you, but I can't live on,
I cannot.
Words. And I mean, if you have a bad night's sleep, just one bad night's sleep, you're in a shitty mood the next day, typically, you don't feel, and so on. It's amazing. So sleep is crucial, and more, and it's great. In the last 10 years, and especially with COVID, the emphasis has been get a good night's sleep. This is crucial for your health. And but it's particularly crucial for obvious reasons for your brain health and your sanity and your psychic well-being. So that's important. The other thing this explains, of course, is why we say we sleep 7, 8 hours a night, but of course, once upon a time you slept for 16 or 17 hours a night. When you were a baby, that's what you slept, and we've also worked on that. And I don't want to go into that in detail, but it's one of the most interesting things that came out of that study that we did on sleep in babies was that to understand why they sleep longer is the nature of sleep changes dramatically at a very early age. In the earliest years, sleep is overwhelmingly for processing. That is for what they call pruning of the neural network. That is, it's sort of learning to be a human being. Obviously there's certain stuff that is built in, but that's who you learn who you are, and you learn the outside world and how to deal with it, and so on. And it's continually changing the architecture, the detailed architecture of the brain, and you become AASTHA Jane, and I become Geoffrey West eventually. But all of that happens in the first 2.5 years. And after 2.5 years, you start to get dominated by repairing the damage, as well as, of course, there is processing, but repair starts to already happen. So what this tells you is that the first 2 to 3 years are absolutely crucial for the brain. And so stimulating babies up to that age is going to have a profound effect. And babies that are deprived of stimulation and that will suffer in some form or another in terms of their neural development and their psychic and intellectual development. So, people have talked about this in many ways, but you can see it. The data is extraordinary when you look at it in terms of sleep, the role of sleep in this. And so that was a sort of that came as a big surprise, by the way, and it was also to us, and it was an extremely interesting example of how you have a theory. We have a theory of sleep. We had theory of sleep that covers the individual, the adult individual, and it covers across species. Great, agrees with the data, lovely and lovely. And then you say, well, let's now look at it, what we call ontogenetically, as you go down in age. And we thought, oh, maybe it'll be like animals that, when you're an infant, you're just like a cat, that's what and it turned out completely wrong. It's completely different because we didn't realize how crucial, which is obvious in retrospect, crucial this idea of processing and pruning dominates in the early years and leads to a whole different scaling behavior and so on, which as I say, no point in going into here, other than a good lesson of how important it is to have a theory and then make predictions for something and then test them and see whether they're right or wrong. And that's how you build up, of course, science. And that's why, going back to what I said, these people claiming that they're going to do things that make people live for 200 years haven't done that. So that's why I'm angry that they make those statements so glibly. Okay, I don't mind them speculating. Honestly, I don't mind them speculating about it. But some of the statements I've seen have been truly hyperbolic. I'm sorry to harp on that, but it's annoying.
No, I agree with you. Yeah.
And it's annoying. Yeah, go ahead, please.
No, I'm curious about the example of sleep you mentioned in babies. So you're looking at the theory of sleep for babies in the first 2 or 3 years, and based on that, I guess you're coming up with the conclusion that the brain, the processing power of the brain in the first 2 3 years is very strong, and
Yes.
hence stimulation is pretty important. And stimulation
Yes.
here, you mean intellectual stimulation, like reading to babies, talking to them? What does stimulation mean here?
I mean, everything. I mean, everything, stimulation from just everything from, hugging, holding, which mothers and fathers naturally do, hopefully, but to talking to them and, being with them all the time and showing them little lots of toys and artifacts around and having social behavior. I mean, of course, traditionally, and in certainly in rural areas, especially in a place like India, babies are often brought up in an extended family anyway, and they get a version of that anyway. So I think in let's call it a more natural state, when we were hunter-gatherers, probably this happened in a more natural way. That is that babies were held a lot, and they were just sort of hanging around with everybody else and the 10 other children that were playing with them. But now, where in modern Western type societies, where there might be no other children or no other babies, or no other, not an extended family, more isolation, even though people try to talk, the stimulation may not be surprisingly may not be as great. So it's kind of interesting, actually, especially when there are families and people, with people who are poorer, don't have the resources, they're having to work, they've got so many other things to do. And so it's that kind of thing I'm thinking of when I say that. So I think it's a potential issue of certain parts of modern society which were more natural in previous states or in states that still exist in poorer parts of the world, ironically.
And then if their sleep is disrupted in the first 2 or 3 years, that's probably also pretty critical.
Yes, I don't know how that plays into it. That's a very interesting question. The question of quality of sleep and interruption of sleep. That is, if a baby or even a person, let's look at a person first. If you sleep 8 hours, but it's 4 times 2, it's 4. It's 2 times. Is that better or worse? Because I think there are, and I don't know enough about this, I think in many traditional societies, people would wake up in the night, believe it or not, and do things, and then go back to sleep.
Mhm.
Maybe that was better. Maybe that's more natural for us. I don't know. I don't know enough about it, and I don't think people know enough about it, to tell you the truth. But it's true about babies. Babies, I have believe it or not, for the last few months, I have a baby living with us. My daughter and family are here for various, they're in transition. And it so happens they're living with us for these few months. And in fact, they're leaving next week to form a new life. But they have a 7-month-old baby as well as a toddler. And the baby in the last few weeks has started sleeping badly. So this is interesting because she wakes up a lot. And so the question is, what does that do to her, the baby? But she wakes up my daughter a lot, who is grumpy in the morning because she's not getting the full amount of sleep, and it's interrupted. So I don't know the answer. I'm sure there's been studies of various kinds of it. I don't know, probably for adults, I don't know how much is done for babies, but it's a very interesting question. And there are very interesting questions like that. It's like, where we've developed things that question a lot, how universal and natural are they? Like in many cultures, we eat 3 meals a day. I don't know, I've never asked anybody this, but in India, traditionally, do people eat 3 meals a day? I never even thought about it till now. I mean,
Yeah, probably
the thing that
more than three.
they have breakfast,
Indians
lunch,
snack a lot.
dinner. I mean,
Hmm.
back, I don't know now. Now they probably do because they've been influenced by the West. But 100 years ago, or 1,000, do you know or do you think of your grandparents ever talk about having 4 meals a day or 1 meal? I mean, but anyway, it's an interesting question. How many,
There's definitely a big culture of fasting here because of
yes,
religious fast.
yes, that's
But
true.
that's a good question. I'll ask my grandmother. I don't
Yeah,
know if they
ask
used
us.
to eat 3 meals a day a
They
hundred
always
years
eat.
ago.
Uh, no, I remember from her grandmother.
Right.
So
Yeah.
kind of thing. I know, because certainly in the cultures I've grown up in, 3 meals a day. But why 3 meals a day? Why don't we eat? 1 meal for most people is not enough. That you can understand. But why not eat 10 meals a day? That is very small meals every couple of hours. And we do snack. We know various people, but and I don't know if that's been built into past cultures or not. I don't know if 200 years ago in medieval times in Europe, did people snack? I have no idea. And people may know this, but I don't. But the question is, I'm interested, of course, in what did happen and how culturally universal it is, but why? Why is it 3 meals a day? And because cows don't eat 3 meals a day, right? I mean, they eat
Mhm.
150 meals a day, as far as I can tell.
Mhm.
But people might have done work looking at dogs, domestic. Of course, they're domestic, and so they're not. I don't know what happens in the wild to these animals, how often they eat. But anyway, it's a sort of interesting question as to why and how. It's obviously to do with the digestive time. Small animals obviously have to eat more, that's for sure. because they metabolize so much faster. A mouse would die probably on 3 meals a day.
Hmm. And on the point of sleep, do you think as our society transitions into a more knowledge-based culture, and especially for those that are doing more intellectually demanding tasks, do you think those people need more than 8 hours of sleep? Is there any research
Uh,
on that?
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I certainly know that if I go for a long hike, well, I can't do it anymore. When I used to go for long hikes, um, I would need to rest, need to sleep,
Hmm.
a long hike. And I also know that if I don't hike and I work all day, I try to do my calculations and I'm stuck and I'm struggling and I'm really, for many hours, I need to sleep. So both contribute, obviously, the physical and the intellectual. And I don't know whether we will see any cultural changes or social changes coming about from that. I have often thought, I do think, in fact, there's an anecdote about Winston Churchill. One of the amazing, so in the middle of the Second World War, he had a bunker in the center of London. And it was, and they had this control room and space was very limited. But one of the things he insisted upon, that there be a bed there, and he insisted that every day he would take a nap. He would sleep for an hour or two every day. And he would say, because I double the length of my life, because that 1 hour nap, I can then work for another 8 to 10 hours or whatever. And so he said, doubles my life, as a kind of cartoonish anecdote. So it may be that would be better for all of us, breaking up our sleep, or people have talked about integrating naps into our lifestyle. I have often conjectured, and I've talked to my anthropological friends, that hunter-gatherers almost certainly took, they're hunting and gathering, and then they sit around and talk or whatever they did, and then they probably took naps at various times. What are they going to do? I mean, you can't hunt and gather for 16 hours a day. So, and they didn't read or write at that time. So what did they do? They probably napped. I don't know. It's sort of intriguing. By the way, it's also intriguing to think about elephants sleeping only 2 or 3 hours a night. And what the hell do they do with the other, 20 odd hours? I mean, in the middle of the night, what do they do? They talk to one another. I don't know. They must do something. Or they just stand there, sit, lay down. Anyway, it's
That
sort of
is
interesting.
interesting.
This brings up all
It
kinds
is.
of these weird
Right.
questions
Right.
that you realize you haven't thought about before, and I've looked up. It's very hard to find answers to, and even though I suspect some of these things have been investigated, by naturalists and anthropologists and so on.
Yeah, I would think some of the research and just how
No,
ancestors used to
I
sleep
just have
is
not been able
probably out there. Right.
Yeah, I've not done a serious search. I just Google and see what turns up. But anyway.
Okay. How much more time do you have? I just want
Well,
to
I
be
should
mindful.
leave shortly. I should probably, it's now getting on for 12:30 here, midday. Probably the best, having done this, I probably should take a nap, having talked about that. I, I need to join my colleagues. So we should probably finish up. If there and anything of any great urgency you want to delve into, I'm happy to.
Okay. No, I just have a few last questions. I know you mentioned universities and you've looked into some of like the scaling laws there. And one thing I had thought of, in fact, was that you talk about in your book that cities never die, or most cities not never die, but most cities survive because they're constantly adapting. But companies almost always die.
Yes.
and
Yes.
the average lifespan is around 10 years or so. What about institutions like universities? Because a lot of them have been around for hundreds of
Yes.
years.
Sure.
Why don't they die? What is going on there?
Well, universities do die, but they're very few. I mean, it's true.
Right.
Now they're,
Yeah.
but it's, because universities are sort of somewhere in between cities and companies somehow. They, you know, they're off their, I mean, companies are sort of private and individualistic. Cities are very public, and you know, a specific city may die, but we need cities. I mean, you know, so you have to build another city. If this one disappears, you've got to put some people's. So you can sort of see in a very naive way that cities are going to persist, whereas companies are subject much more to external forces. I mean, the external markets and so on, and they're very susceptible, and they become very static. Typically, the bigger the company, the more static it typically becomes. Very hard for it to adapt and so on. And one of the hallmarks of a city is that it's extremely diverse, and it's very adaptable. It's not top down. Companies are top down, highly structured. Cities, of course, there's an administration, there's mayors, but they're very loose. And in fact, the best kind of administrations of cities is they encourage more churning and more activity and so forth, and they're very tolerant of diversity and change. The best cities. Universities are sort of a bit of both. I mean, we need them because they're educational. So if a university disappears, you've got to have some other institution to take its place, kind of thing, to do what they were doing. And the nature of what they do, even though the details of it change, the occupation of education is one of those necessary things that is there. So it's there, and universities, in terms of the details of what they do, need to be evolving and adapting, and indeed they obviously do. They have of course, they have this constant supply. As I say, they have this constant supply. On the other hand, they also have a corporate aspect to them, namely they have to balance the budget. They have to attract students and faculty. They have a product, which is on the one hand students getting degrees and then being successful in the marketplace, whatever it is, and of course in the modern era, universities producing research and products of various kinds of innovation and so forth, and so they're sort of they're fixed pieces of society. So it's hard for them to disappear in a way. By the way, the longest serving, I mean, universities have been around for over 1,000 years, but of course the longest serving institutions are religious institutions. I mean, the Vatican is the classic example, which has many of the characteristics of all of these things, of cities. In fact, Vatican is a city. I'm right, but it has the characteristics of a university, a city, and a company. And the Vatican has all of the above. It's a huge corporation. It's an educational institution, and it's also a city where people live and thrive. The big question there, of course, it seems to be that just as society needs education, the big question is, does society need religion? And apparently it does. Even if it's mythical in what it's preaching and so on, nevertheless it seems to need some spiritual dimension, and religious institutions, for some people, supply that. That is, people don't seem to be able to be religious and spiritual without some bricks and mortar and some hierarchy telling them what to do. I mean, India being one of the places where that is in one ways is very present, but also is less hierarchical, which is sort of interesting. At least that's my impression.
What is less hierarchical?
Well, I mean, the religions of India seem to be less hierarchical than the religions of Europe. Christianity is extremely hierarchical and structured. And one of the attractions of many Eastern religions is they're less so of that nature. I mean, ironically, the only religion in the West that is not hierarchical is Judaism. Of course, it's not hierarchical. It doesn't have, but that's because it's so tiny, probably. But it doesn't have that kind of imposition of something analogous to the Vatican or the Church of England or whatever it might be. Islam is hierarchical, very hierarchical. But somehow in the East, in the far, I mean, India, even China, I mean, when it is much less, seems to be much less so. Anyway, but having said all that, there's a spectrum. People seem to need it. They need to have, which is one of the great mysteries of life, frankly. Why do we need it?
So what would need to happen for companies to survive forever as well?
Well, it's not clear they can. But they need to be more like cities. As to put it in simple terms, the companies that have been around for, as you said, when we did our analysis of the longevity of companies in the United States, which is where we had the data, we discovered, and the companies were public companies. They were on the stock exchange. We found that the analog to expected lifespan was about 10 years, as you said. Which was surprising. We were kind of surprised. There's a huge tail. There's lots of outliers. There's companies that, of course, live 40, 50, 100, even several hundred years, but very small number, so not very many. And if you look across the globe, there are companies that have lived 1,000 years or 1,500 years. But what you discover about those companies that are truly long-lived is, yes, they're companies and they're businesses, but they're in very small niche markets. They're typically, some vineyard or some beer company or something that is, or some inn, some hotel that is very special, something very specialized. And I talk about this in my book. The longest lived company ever, if you take out the religious institutions, is a company whose name I have forgotten, that was founded in Japan in roughly 585. And what is remarkable about that company, is it survived all this time, but it died about 5 years ago. It disappeared, let's put it that way. It disappeared 5 to 10 years ago. I don't remember exactly when. And you ask yourself, what did this company do? Again, it was a niche market. It built monasteries. And it thrived tremendously while Japan was still very strongly a Buddhist country. It still is a Buddhist country in principle, but the Second World War had a profound influence, particularly on Japan, and changed the culture dramatically. And building monasteries was no longer a thriving industry. And this company somehow wasn't able to evolve and adapt so that it could build other things and survive. So that's an interesting example, and is one of the reasons for it's a sort of extreme example of why companies disappear, is that they grow, they thrive, but by thriving, of course, they're extremely dependent upon external markets, obviously, because that's what they're there for, is to supply markets. And what happens is that typically at the beginning, a company, a small group of people forming a company, has lots of ideas, lots of products, and so on. And that gets narrowed down. The dimensionality of their product space gets narrowed down by the response of the market, even though some of the best ideas have to get thrown away. And some of the ideas they think are rather mundane and not so interesting take off. But that's what defines the company. And they build on that, and the company thrives and grows and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And typically what happens is that it has to form a very powerful bureaucracy. It needs it to run the company and to pay the taxes and sweep the floors and get the office space and so on. So a company becomes more and more administrative and bureaucratic, and its more innovative side gets smaller and smaller as a percentage of the size of the company. And it's in the grip of the external markets. And if there's a change, especially in a short period of time in the market, it's very hard for it to adjust and evolve and adapt, because younger, more agile companies are coming up and moving into that product space. That's just the way it is. So it's very hard. And cities don't have that problem. Not only that, cities, as I said earlier, typically go the opposite direction. As the city grows, it expands its dimensionality. All kinds of weird and wonderful businesses come up, and detailed businesses, things that could not survive in a small town. Like, you could imagine, in fact, there exists a business in New York City that sells antique fireplaces. Now, in a town of 100,000, that business ain't going to survive. Just aren't enough people. But in a metropolitan area of 15 million people, sure. So all kinds of weird, wonderful, highly specialized things can survive and thrive, and they grow more. So it expands its diversity rather than limiting it. And so it becomes more multidimensional rather than less dimensional. And at the same time, it becomes a good city, a great city. It becomes very tolerant of crazy people, of people on the edge. And, that provides an expanding boundary for ideas to develop. So if you're in a city that has that feeling, you think, well, yeah, maybe I could do that. Let's try to do this. Let's put on this play, or let's open a store that only sells chess pieces, or, something crazy or whatever. So it's very different than a company. A company is not very tolerant. In fact, they're usually highly intolerant of people that don't toe the line, and that are mavericks. And even companies that profess to do that, like Google, which, if you go there, it's actually underneath the surface is pretty conventional, really, on the grand scale of things. It might be might be a little more, it probably is more tolerant of ideas, maybe, than, I don't know, some more conventional company. But on the grand scale, compared to a city, it's tiny.
I completely agree with you. I see that difference. And you're saying universities are maybe a bit like cities where there's this free flow of ideas with students.
But they still have to be very structured, like a company, they still have that. So there's some hybrid in some weird way. And, and in fact, universities, most of the battles are between those two things, of course. Getting a new department or a new program, or, let's try this idea, is pushback from, well, that's not the way we do things, or, it's going to cost this amount of money, and we don't have the support staff for it. So it's it's an interesting mixture. And by the way, the other thing about universities, there's many different types of universities. I mean, there's major research universities, there's universities that are primarily small colleges, teaching oriented, then there's community colleges and so on. So there's a whole spectrum, which we've actually looked at. And what is interesting, if you look at those, you can see from their scaling laws what they're emphasizing. Obviously, if you go to Harvard or Stanford, research dominates everything, not everything, but it's very dominant. Whereas if you go to a community college, teaching and having as many students with low fees, keeping fees low is important, and having low faculty salaries to keep those fees low relative to major research universities that are willing to pay humongous amounts of money to get the research they think is going to be sexy and get Nobel Prizes and so on. So there's a complete spectrum. Cities don't have quite that. I mean, most cities are trying to do similar kinds of things. It does change across countries, obviously, but in a way, I'm speaking a bit out of turn, but cities in India are probably trying to do similar things to cities in the United States or in Spain. But the spectrum of universities, especially in the United States is the extreme example, have this extraordinary spectrum, which is very powerful, actually, I think. Of different functionalities of types of universities.
So it adds the diversity and caters to the different needs of students.
Yeah, and it's very catering to different needs of students and society. And diversity, as I'm sure you know, is a crucial element of the resilience and robustness of ecosystems, for example. That's why we're concerned about the loss of diversity, loss of species. And it is because it opens up greater possibilities. So if you're a company and you've narrowed your diversity, when the externalities change, you're not able to move into it. But a city has an ecosystem. Okay, the climate changes, this changes. Well, we've got these guys, we may lose human beings, but, the ants are going to do incredibly well. Whatever. I take a silly example. But, that's the point. You have all these possibilities and you can continue and thrive as a system. Individual parts may wither and disappear, but the system as a whole can continue. But companies, the whole bloody thing gets lost.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to stay tuned for future releases or find previous podcast episodes, you can subscribe to my newsletter, livelongerworld.substack.com. If you wish to follow me on social media, I'm on Twitter, where my handle is AASTHAJS. That's it for now, and see you next time.